Well, welcome to my presentation. It's called Upstate New York, America's Spiritual Soul. Now, most of my talks go for about an hour spot on. This one's one of my longer talks. It goes about an hour, 15 minutes. So make sure you have a comfortable chair there where you're sitting. Well, let me start off talking about when I was in 7th grade. We had social studies class. I don't know why they called it social studies and just didn't call it history, because it was basically a history class. And when you're in 7th grade, the social studies class is devoted to the history of New York State. And my teacher for this was Mr. Szymanski. Kind of a lean, gaunt fellow, always wore this 3-piece suit. He had this ultra short brush cut. I mean, before it was fashionable to wear your hair real short, I mean, it looked like this guy must have got a cut every 3 days to keep it as short as he did. He had this nervous habit too, of like pulling out his collar like Henny Youngman. He's got a nervous thing. So he'd be talking about New York State history. And he'd be telling us about, the key links on the Underground Railroad was from New York State, and how the women's suffrage movement got its start over here. And he'd go on about all these different reform movements that had their origins here in actually upstate New York. Not only suffrage and abolition, but child labor and temperance and prison reform, prostitution reform, workers' rights. And I was a real curious kind of little kid. And I raised my hand one day and I said, but Mr. Szymanski, why is it that all of these different reform things had this kind of initiative here in New York State and upstate New York? And Mr. Szymanski gets this kind of panicky look on his face when he didn't know the answer and start pulling on his collar like this, And then he fall back on his universal answer if he wasn't quite sure, what the real answer was. He'd say, oh, well, the answer is Erie Canal, right? That was the fallback. You know the answer, the Erie Canal, say that. Well, it just so happens that the answer to that question lies in some other explanations that are kind of interesting. And it lies in the explanation that upstate New York was kind of the spiritual center of the United States in the early 1800s. There was a process where there were these new religious ideas that spurned new ways of thinking that then led to social reform. And it influenced things that you wouldn't think it could influence. Let's take, for example, women's suffrage movement. And you say, well, what would this have to do with new religious movements? Well, if we go back over to England, way back in the 1600s, there's a fellow by the name of George Fox. And he was in this church service sitting in the back, and he was sitting through this really long, boring sermon, and he was kind of dozing off. And finally, the guy gets done with the sermon. He says, thank goodness I can get out of here. And he says, okay, now it's time for the public forum, to talk, questions and answers. And he thinks, oh, goodness, we got to go through all this now. So he's dozing in the back, and these people are getting up making these statements. And finally, this one woman gets up and starts to speak. And this fellow who's a minister said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to sit down. We do not allow women to speak in this church. And all of a sudden, he woke up and he jumped up. And Fox said, why can't she speak? How come she can't speak in this church? This just really bugged him, right? So there were some other things about the church. And he didn't even know who this lady was or what she was asking, but just the fact that she couldn't speak bothered him. So there are other things that bothered him, so he decided to break away and form his own denomination, which he called the Society of Friends, or we refer to as the Quakers. Now, as most people know, Quakers kind of migrated into America with William Penn into Pennsylvania. And even when they moved over to Pennsylvania and formed this separate group, Society of Friends, they weren't always friendly towards each other. They started to still have some battles among themselves. And one of the people that was kind of upset with the way things are going is Elias Hicks. He looks like kind of a grumpy guy, and he was pretty grumpy about the way the Society of Friends was going in Pennsylvania. He didn't feel that they were following through like they should have been following through on rights for women, because they still had women segregated on one side of the church and the men on the other. And they weren't fighting as strong for abolition, because there were some members in the church who still owned slaves, and their worship was too formal, he felt. So he was like Splitsville, forming my own denomination. And it became known as the Hicksites. And he moved this denomination up into upstate New York, over in the village of Waterloo. And they weren't there long before there was some more arguing about whether they were following through on these reforms. And they had another split. The Hunt and McClintock family says, we're going to break away a bunch of us, and we're going to be a different group. We're going to call ourselves the Progressives in 1848. And not long after that, later in the year, a very important thing happened with the Progressives. Because if you know your New York State geography, you know that Waterloo is just a stone's throw from Seneca Falls. And later that year, they had the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls that was attended by way more people than they ever expected, over 200 people. And over half of those people were those progressives from that Quaker denomination that broke off with Hunt and McClintock. If you look at the group of people that planned that very first Women's Rights Convention, four of the five were Quakers. Matter of fact, you could see two of the McClintocks, McClintock and Hunt there, the ones that led the breakaway of the progressives. And you could see Lucretia Mott there too. Now, Lucretia is one of the big three, right? Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott. And she was originally from Nantucket, a whaling community. And it was very common among the whaling communities to have a very large population of Quakers there. If you remember Moby Dick, there was Starbuck, right, who was a Quaker. And one of the reasons it was so common to have so many Quakers in these whaling communities is that the men were off on these whaling expeditions for maybe 6, 8, 10 months at a time. And the women had to step forward and run a lot of the things in the community and the town. And the Quaker women, since they were given more voice and rights within the church, were better positioned and had the authority, felt more confident running things in the community. Matter of fact, if you look at the real famous suffragettes there, Lucretia Mott, Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul, 3 of those 4, with the exception of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were all Quakers. Now, we talked about this first Women's Rights Convention, that out of the 200 people, half of them were these progressive Quakers. What about the other half that weren't Quakers? Well, that other half were people who were either participated in or were very, very strongly influenced by another religious event. And that was the Second Great Awakening that happened between 1820 and 1850. And the center of this awakening was not in Georgia or not in Kentucky. It was actually taking place in upstate New York, Western New York to be particular. As a matter of fact, this area was referred to as the Burnt Over District because it was fired so many times with the flames of these continual revivals going through that they call it the Burnt Over District. And all of this Second Great Awakening was led by this scary looking guy, Charles Grandison Finney. Great big guy, right? He was like 6'3", he went about 250, 280, blazing eyes. I'd like to have this guy bearing down on you, right? During some type of revival. Well, he came in and he wanted to run these revivals, but he had a different concept of how these different services should go. And he called this method the New Measures Method. And what this whole thing looked a lot like was the game show Price is Right. Do you ever see this game show Price is Right? And the people are in the audience and somebody shouts, "Hey, so-and-so, so-and-so, come on down." And they run down to contestant row and everyone's cheering and they get all of these people there and they're cheering. That's a lot what Finney's revival meetings look like and how he kind of structured it. So for example, you know, before the revival session, he'd be talking, people would come up to him and they'd be telling him all these different kind of things. So he'd go into the session and he'd have this bench right in front of him, empty bench, and it'd be called the anxious seat. Another room off to the side called the indecision room. And the whole crowd would be going, and he'd be preaching, and he'd be going at it, and the crowd would be yelling and cheering. And at some point during his preaching, he'd say, Jack Kowiak is in the audience there. and he is a profligate sinner and a drinker. Come down to the anxious seat. And Jack would be up in the audience going, what, who, me? You know, because his relatives and stuff would turn him in, right? You know, what? So they'd push him out down the seat, and the crowd would all push him down the aisle, and they'd be yelling and cheering, and he'd come down to the anxious seat. And Finney would go to town and start working on him and go, boom, boom, boom. And if the guy couldn't decide that he wanted to enter the kingdom of God, he'd go into the indecision room to think it over. And then he'd bring him back, and Finney would go to work on it. And the crowd would be yelling and cheering, just like on The Price is Right. And it was great theater. Oh, people just packed in to see these types of things. But it wasn't just a show. It was extremely influential when people left those events to change their behavior. For example, if you look at early American alcohol use, in 1830 on average, every person in the United States drank almost 4 gallons of straight alcohol every year. They weren't big beer drinkers back there. They would drink and hooch. By 1845, the average had plummeted to 1 gallon, the lowest figure ever except for the dozen years of Prohibition. And social scientists attribute that drop almost entirely to the influence of the Second Great Awakening. To give you a benchmark, I mean, that's double what the consumption was maybe 8 years ago or so. So the way Finney communicated was really, really interesting. Now, when you think of some kind of a preacher, generally you think in a revival, you think of somebody being a Bible thumper, right? They got the Bible right in their hand there, and they're talking out of the Bible, recording passages and giving their interpretation. Finney didn't do that. No, he was not a Bible thumper. In those days, there wasn't this idea of this literal interpretation of the Bible that you have with fundamentalism and conservative evangelicalism. The Bible was just considered an inspired document with some general ideas. And the other big stream of thought in theology at this time was natural theology that was propagated by William Paley from the Enlightenment. And he felt that people should be convinced of their religious beliefs by making rational arguments. You should appeal to people's reason to convince them of religious belief. And Finney took this all to heart and melded into his to give people a clip from a movie. It's Finney preached, somebody else, but an excellent example of how preached. We'll see is a segment from Sergeant York, and you're going to see a preacher being played by Walter Brennan, very young Walter Brennan, dressed up like an old man like he's done in most of his parts. And what happens is Alvin York, Gary Cooper, is this real hellraiser. Oh, he's going around town causing all much problems and such. And Alvin's mother has to go to talk to Alvin to try to straighten him out and listen to Brennan Cooper, because he doesn't quote the Bible and he doesn't quote religious doctrine. Instead, he makes these kind of rational arguments. He appeals to his reason using things that he knows that Alvin kind of can relate to in his daily life. Here we go. Now, the other thing that had to happen was once somebody accepted his message, they were kind of entering the kingdom of God, as he called it. And there was what he referred to as an emotional discontinuity that had to happen. So when you entered his kingdom of God, it wasn't like you're walking in, okay, here I go, I'm in. It had to be this big kind of kaboom type of event, this big emotional event to have that happen. So to give you a flavor for this, I'm going to read a contemporary account that was written about one of these revivals during the Second Great Revival. And it may sound a little strange to you in terms of some of the things that were going on, but just try to keep in mind the context of the period in time we're talking about in these early 1800s. So as they describe the revival, they say, sometimes as many as 20,000 people gathered from a 100-mile radius. camping in the woods in family groups from a Friday to a Tuesday, and listening to sermons morning, noon, and night. Each meeting reached a crescendo of excitement, at which point hysteria generally broke out, and the congregation was prone to twitch, jerk, leap, shout, sob, and emit an eerie sound called the holy laugh. Those who believed themselves repentant came forward and fell on their knees. Crowds would follow the preacher's words, calling out, "Amen, yes, Lord, hallelujah," or make barking noises that were supposed to tree the devil. Oh, did that look a little familiar to you? Yeah. I mean, just as nowadays sporting events are seen as kind of a socially acceptable way for people to kind of let off steam and let off an emotional outlet. Similarly, these revivals played the same role. Someone was working hard in the field, and this was like an acceptable way for you to let off your emotional energy. Not so strange after all. Well, let's look at another example of entering the kingdom of God from that very same movie that I spoke about before. And you're going to see some other people in this clip. Obviously, Gary Cooper is going to be there being Elvin York. And then this actress, Margaret Wycherley, plays the mother of Elvin York. Elvin's girlfriend is this woman, Joan Leslie, who was actually a protege of Howard Hughes when he had his movie studio days. This young actress, I'm not sure. This is another sister. And then this is the other sister of Elvin. I don't know if you recognize her if you look at her face. That's a very young June Lockhart, the woman that played the mother on Lost in Space and a whole bunch of other movies and roles. So in this clip that I'm going to be playing for you, Elvin has been cheated out of some land, or he feels at least that he was cheated out of the land. Well, the other thing that was very influential in changing behavior was a couple of concepts also that Finney leveraged, and that's postmillennialism and perfectionism. And many people are familiar with the term millennialism. It's kind of linked back to some passages in the book of Revelation that talks about the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. What most people are familiar with is premillennialism. And that's the belief that the world gets badder and badder and things are going to pot really badly. And the four horsemen of the apocalypse come in, and then there's the second coming of Christ to kind of save the day. But that was not the predominant belief at the time Finney was preaching. The predominant belief among Christian denominations in the early 1800s was something called postmillennialism. And in this belief and in this interpretation, the world actually starts getting gooder and gooder and better, not going downhill. And the world gets so good that the earth is indistinguishable from heaven. And at that point, Christ returns down to earth. Now, he married this idea of postmillennialism with another concept called perfectionism. And I'll show you how we did it in a second. So what's perfectionism? Well, that has to do going back to Martin Luther, where he had his big deal about justification by faith alone. And there was a flaw in this whole idea of justification by faith alone. And he knew about the flaw, and he tried to do some things to remedy it, but it wasn't kind of solved till later. And the issue was, if you have somebody and he's a really bad person, you know, every day he comes home and he kicks his dog and beats his wife, right? And finally he gets saved for justification by faith. But a year rolls by, and then he starts backsliding, right? He goes back to kicking his dog and beating his wife. Well, what do you do with this justification by faith that already happened, that was given by God? It doesn't look like good theology to have God be an Indian giver and give this back again, right? So Luther toyed around with ideas having to do with purgatory and such, but it didn't get addressed in terms of an answer that it was accepted broadly until John Wesley came along, who founded the Methodist. And he said, well, look, this is the way it works. He said, there's this first step where there's this salvation you get from God, where it's justification by faith, by the grace of God, and this erases the original sin of Adam. But then there's a second step, that you've got this perfectionism process, because you've got all of this residual sin and all this other stuff. And you go on this continual effort throughout your life in partnership with the Holy Spirit to try to erase all of this residual sin, to perfect yourself as much as possible before you die to get into heaven. So the way Finney interpreted this stuff is he said, to usher in the second coming, we need to perfect not just ourselves, but society, all right? It wasn't an individual thing. We need to look around and perfect things that are wrong in society. Things like temperance, right? Bad drinking. And that's why he was able to get alcohol consumption so far down. And then anti-slavery. He's a big supporter of the Underground Railroad. It became a very important junction within New York State. And then also as well, women's rights. Now, even though Finney looked like a scary looking guy, he was actually very, very good to women. Yeah, girl power. His whole operation when he rolled through these towns in the revivals was run by women. They did all the booking of the halls, they handled all the financing, they did all the publicity, they managed all of the events from start to finish. And it was unheard of for women to take those kind of roles then, but he wanted to promote women into those roles and show society that they can do these types of things. Also, it didn't stop there. When Finney finished his preaching, he went on to become the president of Oberlin College, and he made that college the very first co-ed educational venue in the United States at the university level. Now, this Second Great Awakening also generated a lot of gender controversy, which was also Finney's doing, because he was calling women down to the anxious seat. And it was unheard of in those days, in a public forum, to a woman to be brought down as the center of attention and even speak before the public in the anxious seat. But Finney didn't care. He was going to do it anyhow. And women flocked to his awakenings because they loved this idea of being called down to the anxious seat, because for them, this was empowering. This gave them a role and a visibility in society they never had before, and it was always suppressed. Where did the biggest revival of this Second Great Awakening take place? Took place nowhere else but Rochester, New York in 1830. Yeah, he was here for about 6 months between between September of 1830 and March of 1831, held about 98 different sermon sessions with these big Price is Right type events. And it was really influential in the Rochester area in upstate New York. For example, there was a couple, Joseph and Abigail Brown, lived over in Henrietta, New York. Their home is still there, as a matter of fact. He was kind of a farmer and also served as justice of the peace. And when they raised their children, they were always telling them about Finney and what a wonderful preacher and his ideas, especially their young daughter, Antoinette Brown. And she was so taken with these stories of Finney that she wanted to be a minister just like Finney when she grew up. So when she was in school one day, the teacher had a session and was asking all the students, what did they want to be? What were their aims when they grew up? And little Johnny would say, you know, he wanted to be some type of a law enforcement person. And somebody else said that, oh, they wanted to be a lawyer. And when they got to Antoinette, she said she wanted to be a minister, just like Charles Grandison Finney. And the teacher said, no, I'm sorry, Antoinette, you have to pick something else because women aren't allowed to be ministers. And she was crushed, and she went home crying to her mother. And her mother consoled her and said, look, I'm going to take a little white ribbon, and we're going to pin it here underneath your collar. And that's there as a reminder that you could be anything you want. That's what Grandison Finney taught us. And I want you to hold on to this ribbon when other people criticize you or fail to understand your beliefs, so you could stick to them and be what you want to be. And she kept that ribbon actually under her collar up into through her 20s. And she had to touch it a lot of times because she had a lot of doubters and had to fight very hard. But eventually she became the first ordained woman minister in the United States. She was ordained in Butler, New York at a Congregational church, so she was ordained as a Methodist minister. And she had quite a career, especially doing public speaking and writing. She became a prolific writer, wrote articles emphasizing women's rights as well as abolition for the New York Tribune and also for Stephen Douglas's North Star newspaper. She performed the first marriage ceremony ever performed by a woman minister in the United States in Rochester, New York. Her sister-in-law actually was a famous suffragist, Lucy Stone. And she lived to be quite old. In 1920, at age 95, she was the only participant in the early women's rights conventions to actually live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution. Another couple that Finney's preaching influenced a great deal was Josiah Flint Willard and Mary Thompson Willard. They lived over in Churchville, New York. And Josiah's wife, Mary, decided after she had children and was older that she needed a college education. And she became the first college student who was also a young mother. In those days, the women who attended any type of a college type school were quite young, maybe 16 to 18. She was an older student going back to school, which was unheard of. And the other thing that was unheard of is Josiah agreed to support her and become a stay-at-home dad, to take care of the children so her wife can follow through on her ambition to get a college degree. Now, their daughter was also raised to be very forward-looking and very ambitious. And that was Frances Willard, who became the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, some people look at that group as some type of saloon busters, but they were a much broader, bigger reform group than that. Under her leadership, her motto was, do everything. One of the things she said was, the whole world is my parish, and to do good is my religion. She formed the largest social reform organization in the United States, with over 250,000 members spread from coast to coast in the United States, working on a whole listing of reforms: temperance, drug use, prison reform, suffrage, child labor laws, workers' rights, reforms to prostitution, veterans' rights, immigrant education. She had a large skyscraper in Chicago that was devoted to her organization, entirely run by women, working on these reform organizations. And as I was mentioned, it was the largest, most comprehensive, and powerful social reform organization for decades in the United States. And Frances Willard was honored as the first woman to have a statue in Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol. Now, things started to shift later on as the decades went on. And one of the big shifts that happened was this belief in post-millennialism switching over to premillennialism. That was because after the Great Awakening, around the 1850s, there was a huge immigration of Irish coming in who were Catholics. And the Catholics weren't interested in all of this stuff with the Second Great Awakening and all of this. I mean, they were more interested in following the doctrines of the Catholic Church and what was coming down from the Vatican and such. And so the people participating in the Great Awakening, saying that, well, there's supposed to be this big reformation of society to perfect the world for the second coming of Christ, saw this and said, well, wait a second. The Catholics are never going to get on board with our program, so how could there be this big perfection of society? I mean, this just isn't going to happen. So things switched over then to premillennialism, okay? And the big person who leveraged that was, and a lot of the social reform movements went out the window, and the person who leveraged this shift to premillennialism was William Miller and his predictions of the end of the world. William Miller was a gentleman farmer over in Lowhampton, New York. And early in his life, he went into the Army, U.S. Army, And he was involved as an officer in the War of 1812, especially in this big battle, the Battle at Plattsburgh. And military historians will tell you that the American forces had absolutely no business winning that battle. I mean, everything looked like they were goners in this battle, but somehow they pulled it out and beat the British. And William Miller could not believe that they actually won this battle, and he felt there must be some type of divine intervention that happened that caused the Americans to defeat the British. And he went on studying and analyzing the book of Revelation, but also the book of Daniel very heavily to try to understand what was going on. So he came up with this scientific analysis by looking at the book of Daniel and interpreting these different passages to say that the end of the world was imminent. And he went on these preaching circuits. When he'd have these big charts, with all these kind of scientific things and passages of the book of Daniel and Revelation, explaining how this all forecast the imminent end of the world. And he was garnering a large audience. And he started publishing some pamphlets with this fellow, Joshua Himes. And Joshua Himes saw how popular his pamphlets were about the end of the world. And he decided to devote all his resources to manage and support Miller to broaden his speaking tour throughout all of the colonies, or all of the United States. Actually, at that time, it was the United States. And he funded him to go on these big speaking tours, talking about his ideas and his interpretation of the book of Daniel. Now, he didn't speak in the South because part of his pitch was abolition, anti-slavery, and the Southerners didn't want to hear anything about that. So he had to relegate himself up to the North. But he was extremely popular, so much so that they could not fit the number of people into any existing halls for his talks, and they constructed the largest tent ever made in the United States. It held 4,000 people, and they would bring this tent around to fit everybody in there. As it says here, a view of Father Miller's tent and campground at Newark. Actually, that's not Newark, New Jersey. That was Newark, New York. And oh, well, the media, when he came into town, had a field day, making fun of all these people flocking to hear the end of the world. There's a cartoon showing them all in their tent flying up to heaven, right? The grand ascension of Miller's tabernacle. Or here's someone anticipating the end of the world they call the Millerites. And he's going to lock himself into his safe with his hams and his other provisions and thumb his nose at the end of the world when he locks himself into the safe. Or here they are all up in their rooftops waiting to ascend into heaven. And many, many, many people were Millerites. I've got a little message here. Okay. And they do estimate that the US population at this time was about 17 million. And there are about 1 million Millerites. Now, given that he never went down south, right? And there were about 6 million people down south at that point, you're really talking about maybe 10% of the northern population were committed Millerites. And for example, here in Rochester, there were over estimated 1,000 Millerites in those early days. And there was a fellow here, convinced Millerite, he owned a hat store. And at one point, he put up a sign and said, all the hats are free, because he felt the end of the world was coming. He had no need for this hat inventory or this business, and he was giving away all his hats. Well, Miller got pushed at some point to nail things down, come down with some exact dates. So he did some more study of his book of Daniel and Revelation and said that the end of the world is going to occur in 1843, between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st of 1844. And if you paid attention to your history class, you know that the world did not come to an end between those dates. So Miller said he made a mistake in the calculation that it's actually October. So they waited till October, and of course, you know, the world didn't come to an end. And so then there was the great disappointment that the end of the world wasn't coming as forecast. Well, what happened to all of these disenchanted Millerites? Well, there were still some believers. I mean, some people were still trying to recalculate the date, but people said, oh, we did this twice and it's not going to. And there are other people that had a nice thought. They said, well, this happened, the second coming, but the Advent happened in the hearts of believers. But the explanation that really caught on was the idea that the Advent happened in the heavenly realm. And this was promulgated by this fellow, Hiram Edson. Interesting guy. When he was a very young boy, he ran away from home. He wanted to be a sailor. He became a cabin boy. And he worked himself out to be a sailor, and then a first mate, and then a lieutenant, and then a captain. And then he wound up owning his own ship, and then owning a fleet of ships. And he became very wealthy. And at some point, he became a Millerite and became so convinced of it, he devoted all his money and time to this cause. Well, he was in a barn in Port Gibson, awaiting the end of the world. And why do they call that Port Gibson if it's in kind of in the middle of the state? Well, it's because it was on the Erie Canal, right? Just like Mr. Szymanski says, if you don't know, say the Erie Canal. Well, at any rate, he was in this barn with the other Millerites, awaiting the end of the world on the appointed date, and nothing happened. And he was disappointed with everyone else. So he went to cut across this cornfield to console his other neighbor, who he knew also was a Millerite. And while going across the cornfield, he saw this vision. And he saw this vision that the second coming was actually happening up in heaven with the cleansing of the Holy of Holies, right? Cleansing of the heavenly realm. And this was kind of tied into some beliefs in ancient Jerusalem, where the Hebrews believed, where they had the Temple of Jerusalem there, the most sacred part was where they kept the Ark of the Covenant, and that was called the Holy of Holies. And once a year, they had a ceremony to cleanse this Holy of Holies spot. And the way they did the ceremony is they took two goats, and one of the goats was sacrificed. And then the other goat, they had a ceremony where the high priest, especially those of the family of Aaron, would place their hands on this second goat, and they would give all the sins of the Hebrew people that occurred that year onto this other goat, and let the goat carry those sins off into the wilderness, right? And the goat would escape into the wilderness. And actually, that's where we get the term today, scapegoat. It goes way back to those ancient religious practices of letting that goat carry the sins of mankind off to cleanse the Temple of Jerusalem. Well, he had this belief then that the second coming actually happened in the heavenly realm. And then he wound up merging his ideas with some ideas from another woman, Ellen White, who was also a disenchanted Millerite.
As Ellen White sought to understand what the disappointment meant, she had visions. Over her lifetime, she is said to have had 2,000 visions, which Adventists believe came directly from God. Those visions would help chart a course for the new church.
She would often faint on the floor. They'd put a pillow under her head, and she would be seemingly out of it. They would test, and they couldn't see that she was breathing. And then she would come out of these and start saying what she had seen.
Now, Hiram was a believer in her and brought her over to Port Gibson, and later they moved to Rochester, New York. And they merged their beliefs together, and they founded what's known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They founded Seventh-day Adventism, and that denomination, religion, was founded right over here in Rochester, New York. There was another disenchanted Millerite, actually down in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His name was Charles Taze, had a Bible study group. He was a haberdasher. His father had a haberdashery business, men's clothing, and then he kind of inherited that, but he expanded the business, got additional stores, and became quite wealthy with it. And he had a Bible study group, and he was very interested in concepts having to do with Unitarianism, that there was no Trinity, also this idea of universalism, that there was no hell, and also this concept of premillennialism. And he kind of married this up with his Millerite beliefs, And he caught the attention of another religious publisher over here in Rochester called Nelson Barber, who invited him up to Rochester to publish some of his ideas in a new periodical called the Herald of the Morning. And you can see where it's published here in Rochester, New York. Well, this publication got to be renamed, and it was renamed The Watchtower. And it became the start of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, there was a falling out between Barber and Tez over this esoteric argument about atonement. So he left Rochester, went down to Pittsburgh, and then they later relocated over to Brooklyn and founded the Jehovah's Witnesses, which had its genesis among this publication here in Rochester, New York. So when we look at the Millerites, I mean, there's some groupings that became the Seventh-day Adventist, and some became Jehovah's Witnesses. A large portion of them as well became fundamentalists, also referred to as Adventists in those times, which migrated over the conservative evangelicals. Now, even though this didn't strictly happen in Western New York, it happened very, very, very close. You couldn't get much closer. Over in Niagara on the Lake. Right across the river from Lewiston, at the Niagara Bible Conferences they held there between 1883 and 1897 at Queen's Royal Hotel there, they formulated a series of documents that were pamphlets on the fundamentals of Christianity. And they laid out the key beliefs that became the basis for fundamentalism or conservative evangelicalism. The premillennialism we spoke about before. Concept of dispensationalism, that's the idea that history is broken up into eras where God's trying to accomplish different things with man in these eras. Bible inerrancy, that the literal interpretation, you have to make a literal interpretation of the Bible. And also the idea of divine eminence. That God is kind of, looking over everyone's shoulder, kind of micromanages everything that kind of happens on the earth. Another person everyone should know about, especially if you're a Rochesterian, is Walter Rauschenbusch. Very, very famous people, one of the most famous Rochesterians that people in Rochester have never heard of before. But if you go over to Germany and Europe, a lot of people are going to know Walter Rauschenbusch. And if you see any listing of the greatest theologians in Christian history, the top 15 or the top 20, he's going to make every single list. He was born in Rochester in 1861, and he was a family tradition of an extremely long line of ministers going back to the 1600s. You could go back 7 generations of ministers. And he studied to be a minister, and then his first assignment as a minister was over in Hell's Kitchen in New York City for those 10 years. And his experiences there greatly influenced him. He saw horrible things there. He wrote that, "I saw how men toiled all their life, and at the end had almost nothing to show for it. How strong men begged for work and could not get it in the hard times, and how little children died." Well, after this, he went back to teach at the place he studied, the Rochester Theological Seminary. He was a professor there for quite a few years. In fact, this is where he got his degree. This became the Colgate Divinity School that we're familiar with today. And he put out a series of pamphlets there that were been termed the social gospel. He published these in 1907. And they were based upon these post-millennial beliefs we talked about before in terms of reforming society and transforming the life on earth into the harmony of heaven, very similar to what Finney did. But rather than going after perfecting and changing society for slavery or women's rights for suffrage or perhaps drinking, what he went after were the robber barons. He wanted to mold social and economic institutions according to Christian principles to counter the negative effects on the selfishness and competitiveness fostered by capitalism. And his ideas were widely accepted, had very, very high reaches of government. He consulted presidents and world leaders about his ideas. Matter of fact, he was very close to Teddy Roosevelt. And he said Rauschenbusch was the religious wing of his Progressive Party. And it was a lot of the motivation for Roosevelt to get into a lot of his trust-busting activities and the anti-Sherman Law and many of the other things that his administration tried to push. Now, Wilson Bush knocked heads a great deal with the fundamentalists because he had a big beef with them. That the fundamentalists didn't believe in all this social gospel reform. And Rauschenbusch answered and he said, look, sin is not just a private matter between a person and God. There are social sins against humanity and must be addressed for Christianity to have any relevance. And there was this knocking of heads, which actually goes on to this day, that there are many fundamentalists that would not speak well of Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel. But he's highly regarded as a theologian. Very famous biography was written about him called The Great Good Man. And I encourage you to read that to kind of get more informed about Rochester's history and this famous person. Now, when you think about communes, you generally think about these hippie communes in the 60s. Actually, communes started, the original origin of communes was way back with the Cossacks in Russia. And they formed their groups. Everybody gave up all of their stuff to live in this collective. But very early communes happened in upstate New York as well. And one of them happened in the town of Jerusalem, a commune known as the Universal Friends over in Branchport in 1789. And that was started by this woman, Gemma Wilkinson. She was born over in 1751 in Rhode Island, and she became the first American woman to found a religion. She would have been the first woman in the world to found one, but she got beaten by another lady just by a couple years, we're going to talk about in a little bit. When she was young, 25, she fell into a horrible fever, and they thought she was going to die, but she came out of it. And when she came out of it, she said she was no longer just Gemma Wilkinson. She became what she termed the universal friend. And then she had a message to give to the world to start this new religion. And she became this traveling evangelist. And she started preaching a belief system that was kind of a mixture of Quaker, Methodist, and Calvinist type beliefs. And she went on to form a commune group with many of her followers that came to her. And in this communal group she set up in upstate New York, she provided free homesteads. There were many wealthy people who joined this group, and they were able to fund the purchase of the land. Now, the commune rules discouraged marriage, though it wasn't very strictly enforced. And they wore plain language and clothing, much like you'd see the Quakers. They opposed war and slavery. And their first settlement was over in Gore, New York, but they very quickly moved over to New Jerusalem. Now, that's still there today, right on the tip of Keuka Lake in the Finger Lakes. Now it's known as the town of Jerusalem. At that time, it was called New Jerusalem. And they had over 260 followers form a settlement. And they were like the very first people at that time to come into the Western New York region. One of the reasons they were able to settle was making good relationships with the Iroquois. Many people were fearful to settle this region, even though it was phenomenal farmland, because of the French and Indian War, and they were fearful of the Indians. But she established, the first one to establish good relations with the Iroquois. And they formed the largest grist mill in Genesee County. When the soldiers from the Revolutionary War were going through to Fort Niagara, traveling through the upstate New York area, they saw what great farmland it is. And they could grow a particular type of wheat here, the soft winter wheat, which was very, very valuable for making pastries. And upstate New York was largely funded and settled based upon growing this soft winter wheat that they were shipping back to big cities in New York and Philadelphia and actually over to Europe to make high-end pastries. And they took advantage of this. And they started doing very well, and they would build their big meeting houses. This is the first one way back in 1790. And then the final residence here in 1815. Matter of fact, this is a residence that she stayed in, and this home still exists to this day. You can go and visit it. And she had this commune there, and she would travel among the people. She had a special carriage that you could see now over in the Carriage Museum in Canandaigua. She had a special symbol on her carriage, the UF for Universal friend. But she was attacked by a lot of people in the surrounding area. Oh, they would make up these stories that, oh, she would try to impress her followers by walking on water, by having a platform built underneath the water, but the platform collapsed and she went in the water, and she lived in lazy luxury and everybody catered after her, and she was a con artist that was stealing things and claimed immortality. And historians have debunked just about all of those claims. The truth was that she was a woman doing things that women normally didn't do in terms of running the business of the commune and running a religion, and people were highly jealous and suspicious of it. So they were constantly just making up stories about her to put her down. She died in 1819 at the age of 68, and historians recognize her now as the first American woman to found a religion. And they feel she was quite sincere in her religious beliefs, and she was not only effective as a preacher and community leader, but she was there at a time when those roles were not accepted for women. And she made a very important contribution to New York history in terms of having those good relationships with the Indians and forming this grist mill. She actually created the critical mass of population that opened the doors to the subsequent settlement of Western New York. She was the kickstarter that enabled the settlement to happen. Now, another type of commune happened with the Shaker religion. The formal name of those is the United Society of Believers of Christ's Second Coming. And this was a religion founded by a woman, Ann Lee. Matter of fact, she founded this just a couple of years before Wilkinson. So she has kind of the in as being the first woman to found a religion. And since it was led by a woman, they were very strong on women's rights. They called them the Shaking Quakers. They were actually combined Quaker beliefs with some of the beliefs from the commissars of France, who were known as the Trembleurs, because they would shake with the power of the Lord. And that's where they got the nickname Shakers. But they believed in strength of women so strongly that their belief was that in Christ's second coming, he will come back as a woman, come back into female. So she left England and formed a community, a commune, in Neskayuna, New York. And in this commune, they practiced celibacy. The men were separated out from the women. And the only reason they kind of added to the people was that they would take in foundling children, abandoned children and orphans. But they were so suspicious of this community, the local communities passed laws against them adopting children, and that's one of the things that caused them to kind of go out of existence. Many people are familiar with the Shakers from their furniture, but the furniture was actually kind of part and parcel of their religious beliefs and worship. Here's a Shaker memorial that stated, "Therefore our labor is to do good in our day and generation to all men, as far as we are able by faithfulness and frugality in the works of our hands." So this idea of building things that was very frugal and simple, like the clean lines of the furniture, was a way of them expressing their faith. At one point during the Shaker communes, they had these events where the young people were suddenly kind of stricken with religious fervor and would break out spontaneously in these kind of Shaker songs that they would make up on the spot. And musicologists came around at this time, and they started writing these things down, and some of them were handed down and became quite famous, like this particular one.
Simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. Simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be afraid, to turn will be
people are familiar with that song, but did you know the lyrics of the song are actually describing the Shaker worship services? The Shaker worship services were quite famous, and people came from all around to view these, not just in the local area, but presidents of the United States came to see this. People from foreign lands, ministers from foreign countries came in to view this because it was such an amazing thing. They would hold it in a large hall, and the Shakers would do these things that look like close order drills. They would be in lines and be doing these intricate formations. But at some point, a random point, all of a sudden they would stop and all heck would break loose. The men would start jumping up as high as they could, and they would grab in the air and come down. And that was the idea, that they were going to jump up and grab a piece of heaven and bring it down to earth. And then they would also kind of break into these things where they would kind of like pose, like gesture. They would just like freeze in kind of a strange looking contortion. And the women would just start spinning. And they would spin and spin and spin and spin till they collapsed down into the ground to basically be in this religious ecstasy. Well, if you look at the lyrics of the song, "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free." That's the idea of giving away your possessions to live on the commune. "'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be." That's the guys coming down and grabbing a piece of heaven and bringing it down to earth. "And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight." That's the name they gave to the commune. The name of the commune was the Valley of Love and Delight. "When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed." That's the gesturing thing they would do. "To turn, turn will be our delight." That's the women spinning. "Till by turning, turning we come round right." They collapse in ecstasy on the floor. Another famous religious commune was the Oneida community. Now that was head up by this fellow called Noyes. And here's a picture of John Humphrey Noyes with his commune over there in Oneida, New York. Now, his belief in forming the commune was that all sin was a result of selfishness. And the way to get rid of selfishness was to live on a commune and give up all of your possessions. You know, you give up your cattle, and you give up your money, and you give up everything you owe, including your wife. Because he believed in complex marriage where the wives were shared among all of the husbands. And you could see how this could cause a lot of friction, right, among the surrounding community. Also, even with children, the mother would raise the children for 3 years, but then it would go into community children's home, where all the mothers would share in the raising of the children. So the commune actually was very successful, even though it was looked as askance by the surrounding community, by some of their ideas of complex marriage and such, because one of the members of the community invented something called the Newhouse steel trap. And at this time was where they were doing all of the different trapping throughout the Northwest and rest of the United States to bring in beaver pelts and all of this. And this was a better mousetrap in terms of the steel trap. So this brought in a small fortune to the commune, which they invested into other businesses, making flatware and making clothing and such. And at this point, Newhouse got into big trouble because they caught him basically embezzling money. So there was a scandal and he fled and went up to Toronto. So they had the rest of the commune and it kind of broke up, and they decided, well, what are they going to do with these businesses? They wound up kind of incorporating them. And one of them stayed on to this day. And if you've ever purchased Oneida silverware, that is the silverware business that was part of the Oneida commune that they found. Most people are familiar with this concept of Zionism, the founding of a Jewish homeland. But did you know before Israel, the original Jewish homeland was actually in Western New York? To be more precise, a little bit over by Grand Island. There's a fellow by the name of Mordecai Manuel Noah, very influential person. He rubbed elbows with Thomas Jefferson and Madison and such. And he was very concerned about the level of anti-Semitism that was happening at these early stages of the United States. And he felt the Jewish people needed their own homeland that they can go to. And he purchased up most of the land in Grand Island with this idea of making it a homeland for the Jews. He established a plaque there with a name, calling it Ararat, similar to the mountain that the Noah's Ark landed on. You know, that was the idea. They were going to land there in 1825. It never quite took off, but it did plant the seeds of an idea of a Jewish homeland that later formed the ideas of Zionism later in the 19th century. And of course, many people are familiar with the town of Arcadia over in Hydesville, where there was the mysterious rapping, right, of the Spiritualists. And there were the two Fox sisters that went on the road talking about the rappings and these spirits that were there. And actually, I have another whole talk that talks about spiritualism, so I won't get into it so much here. But there was this big forum of Lilydale. The spiritualists formed this model similar to the Bible camp, summer camps of the Methodists, where they had these kind of summer things. And all of these areas among the spiritualists were very heavily involved with social reforms. Very influential. They heavily pushed concepts of abolition and women's rights. And one of the reasons they did this is you know, the spirits can kind of talk with impunity about these things and not be criticized. So women felt confident speaking about these things because they could always say, well, don't blame me, blame the spirits. It's coming from them. And of course, there is the Church of Latter-day Saints, founded over here in upstate New York. You know, unfortunately, we're not going to have any Hill Cumorah pageants. They held the last one. If you get fortunate to see them, they were quite spectacular. But you could still go see the visitor center over there in Palmyra. So when you look at all the stuff I talked about, it was almost like this giant feedback loop going on, where there's these new religious ideas that were popping up that was getting new ways of thinking about the world and society, that was getting these new reforms, and more they reformed, the more they got new religious ideas. And it kept working on this big feedback loop where we wound up getting all of these different religious activity spurring social reform. You know, when Finney was still going to go on starting his second great awakening, he had to make a decision. Some people were telling him, come down to New York City. This is the center of activity. This is where all the press is and all the people and influencers are. Do your awakening there. But Finney said, no, you know something? I want to go more in this pioneer area here in upstate New York. Because these are people with a pioneer spirit, and they're going to be open to new ideas. And I know it's going to grow and be something big because of the coming Erie Canal. So when you think about it, maybe Mr. Szymanski was right all along when he gave his idea of the Erie Canal being the heart of all of these reforms. Well, I want to thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And at this time, perhaps Grace can open up the gallery view, and we'll see if anybody has any questions about the stuff that I spoke about today.